Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today we're talking about natural treatments for addiction. There are a number of addiction programs out there, and some are 12-step, and some are based on confession and counseling, and that's very, very useful for some people. And there are another group that are more natural but biochemical or bioelectrical, and I'd like to talk about those briefly today. The first one is the idea that biochemistry can affect addiction. And it comes from the concept that some people might have certain genes or certain biochemical imbalances without genetic problems or with genetic problems that lead them to have a higher probability of having addiction chemistry and make them more prone to being stuck in loops where they need to stimulate themselves with certain kinds of things, whether it be drugs or a substance abuse, whether it be some kind of sex addiction or whether it be some kind of gambling addiction or even gaming, something that's not a substance, that you're not actually putting a substance in your mouth or smoking or injecting, like heroin or these things. There are many, many paths to addiction, and some of them are biochemical. So my favorite reference on this for the layperson is written by Joan Matthews Larson. And Joan Matthews Larson is a biochemist who lost her son to an addiction at a young age in the 20s, and in his 20s. And her book is called 7 Weeks to Sobriety. And in this process, she breaks down into several groups, several types of biochemical addiction that have to do with whether a person is perhaps the allergic addicted or the histamine addicted or the hypoglycemic addicted are three of them. They're biochemical patterns that lead a person to be very prone or susceptible to addiction. And Joan Matthews Larson practiced in the same building as me in Minnesota for a period of time, and I absolutely love her work and her book, and I've used it for years, and I'm very excited to talk to you about it. So please understand that by reading this book and working with your doctor and your practitioner, you can learn natural ways to assess and treat the foundations of the chemistry behind addiction in many people. Now, that's not to say that a person might not benefit from a 12-step program or some other type of classic Minnesota model from Hazelden or that kind of stuff, but the outcomes from purely doing a 12-step program are pretty poor over time, and the outcomes from Joan Matthews Larson were in excess of 80-85% in many cases, and sometimes higher. So if you combine these methods, you get a much better set of outcomes, and I've seen that too. Let's move on now from chemistry to electricity. It turns out that one of my just heroes is Jay Gunkelman. He's a world authority on EEG and EEG interpretation and analysis and the technology of EEG. And he did some studies that were really interesting. In the early 1970s, 1971, 72, 73, he began to work with some researchers to study addiction. And he found that there were two really interesting patterns that happened in the addicted brain that they could reverse nearly 100% with neurofeedback. One of them was insufficient alpha waves. It was people that were unable to produce alpha waves, especially with their eyes closed. And he would train them to produce these alpha waves. Now, people are normally supposed to produce a lot more alpha waves when their eyes are closed, and a lot more alpha waves in the back of their head than in the front of their head or in the middle. And so, by measuring these alpha waves, he could identify people that weren't able to produce enough alpha waves, train them to make more alpha waves under the right conditions in the right locations in the head, and help reverse addiction. Because these are waves that give a person that calming feeling. Now, we do know that when people drink alcohol, they produce more alpha waves, and that's one of the reasons that people may crave alcohol. If you especially have a very high frequency, low amplitude brainwave chart on your EEG, which a lot of people do, especially very high strung, high achieving people, your brainwave map looks like ants on a page. It's just like very small amplitude, very fast moving waves with not a lot of amplitude, which is the height of the wave. And the frequencies are very, very tight. They're not spread out. So we don't have these nice, long, lazy waves of relaxation, because alpha waves are made when you do yoga, they're made when you do prayer, when you meditate, when you relax, when you paint or sculpt, when you dance slowly. These things are happening when a person does these calming types of activities, very meditative and slow, creative activities, not very like active brain tasks like maybe balancing a checkbook. That's not what we're talking about, or working on a Word document or a spreadsheet or something. We're talking about really slow waves as far as an adult frequency. The other thing that Jay found with his group was, again, back in the early 70s, was the anterior cingulate. Now remember, you've seen me do this before. If you open the brain like this and you go to the inside of the frontal lobe, there's an area called the anterior or front, and cingulate, which means ribbon. And so the brain, when you take the hemispheres apart, there's this ribbon that runs along the inside deep part of the hemisphere, along about where my fingernails are, and that's called the cingulate, or the ribbon. And it goes from the frontal lobe all the way back to the occipital lobe. And that ribbon, the front part of it, is responsible for a lot of high-strung behavior. And so if there's problems with the anterior cingulate and its output, this group under Jay Gunkelman corrected that with neurofeedback. They were able to correct those waves and get them back in order by analyzing them with QEEG brain maps and by fixing them with neurofeedback designed to help that anterior cingulate correct its brain waves back to normal. So those were the two ways electrically that Jay dealt with those problems back in the 70s. So I hope this has been helpful to you to understand chemical and electrical natural ways to assess and treat and aid in the reversal of many addictions.